Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining today's conference on Big Data Bad Actors, which we're proud to be hosting in partnership with Thomson Reuters. I'd like to recognize Deirdre Stanley, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Thomson Reuters, who's with us today. Thank you so much, Deirdre. You've been part of this partnership right from the beginning, and we really appreciate it. I also want to tip my hat to Chip Thresher. Chip, where are you? There you go, Chip, and Kate Friedrich, who we worked with so well over so many years, and then Ashley Alabioso. They've been just tremendous help with us as partners in building today's conference. I want to go one step, one other tip of the hat. I have to tip my old friend Alex Threlfall. We were, when I was at a newspaper called The Wall Street Journal, and I'm sorry on the stage to mention another business journalism outfit, we were co-conspirators when he was at another organization that was a partner organization that I won't mention, but he's just one of the best, and editor-at-large, and you'll see him as a moderator here. We're very proud of this partnership because we do groundbreaking work. We've done groundbreaking work together on transatlantic financial governance gaps that got briefed to European Parliament and to the U.S. Congress. We've done groundbreaking work on the role of the Chinese currency on the global stage, which is changing the very nature of how one does business in the world. And we've done other things as well that are quite important. And we're very proud of this relationship because it's purposeful and it's results-oriented, which is what we think the Atlantic Council is and what Thomson Reuters is in spades. In fact, they're so results-oriented, they've hired most of my former colleagues at the Wall Street Journal. So we're living an exceptionally risky moment for the cyber world. So I see this project as groundbreaking as well. We know that offense is stronger than defense, and this is part of the problem in the world, in this cyber world, in the internet. The Sony hack and the espionage of the Office of Personnel Management Records are two of the most shocking examples of how the internet leaves us vulnerable, and how those incursions have the potential to cause harm. A recent Atlantic Council study that we released last week with Zurich Insurance and the University of Denver showed quantitatively, and you can find this study on our website, that the annual costs of being connected are starting to outweigh the benefits for developed states. That trend doesn't bode well. Unless defense becomes stronger, unless we learn how to deal with the offense of bad actors, and unless the public and private sectors come together to develop a common approach to systemic cybersecurity, the internet of the future will be a far less reliable engine for growth and prosperity. There's also another side to this, and that's what today is about. And that is, they're also good actors. And the question is, how can the good actors take on the bad actors in government, in the intelligence world, in the military, in the public sector, in the private sector, in think tanks? How can good actors, and how are good actors employing cutting-edge technology to take on bad actors? And if you look at the program after the introductory welcome from Deirdre Stanley, we then first go in to what has been happening so far. How have we been able to bring bad actors to justice through studying cross-border data flows? Secondarily, looking at the new technologies and how bad actors are using these new technologies. Then we'll take a look at insider threats. Obviously, some may call this the Snowden panel, but it's not just Snowden. Insider threats are proliferating, particularly in this realm. And then, of course, the Deputy Secretary of U.S. Department of Homeland Security will speak over lunch, leading into a discussion of strategies. Out of everything we've learned in the morning, what are the strategies that should come out of it? And then I think that the day ends on an issue that I think is most important and an area where there are very interesting means to take it on, and that's using big data and other technologies to fight human trafficking. I want to introduce one group that's in the audience today, and we're really proud to have them here. Dr. Laurie Murray, who's spent a lot of time in government and on the Hill in various positions, has brought some U.S. Naval Academy upperclassmen here today. They're part of a current global issues class looking at nuclear weapons and U.S. national security. And where they're interested here is they're not looking only at cyber networks as we are with human trafficking and drugs and other illicit things, but also for possible nuclear trafficking. So great to have you all here. Please chime in and challenge people with your questions. So with that, I'd like to get us started. We are collaborating on this project because we agree, Thomson Reuters and the Atlantic Council, that it's urgent to explore and develop answers to these questions. We hope today's discussion will cast a light on the ways the internet is being used for nefarious purpose, but also elucidate solutions on what we can do to stop bad actors. We're joined today by senior officials and experts, including CEOs, government and private sector leaders, and world-renowned technologists. Today's goal is to set as many cross-sectoral solutions and feedback to the challenges ahead. We always try to look for solutions, and we'll try to draw those out. The one thing one also always has to do at such an important conference is tell you to use your app and Twitter hashtags. So there is an app, and if it's been sent to all of your emails. If you haven't got it, where do they look for it? It's the Convene app in the Apple Store, but it's also been sent to the emails of people who registered to come here. We're also live tweeting this event, live webcasting this event as well from the account at AC Scowcroft. This is a program of the Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security, and hashtag AC Disrupt, and I want to salute our own Alex Ward for his work on this gathering. And we encourage you to engage on social media. With that, I now want to welcome to the stage Deirdre Stanley, Thomson Reuters Executive Vice President and General Counsel.
Thank you so much, Fred. I will be brief because I agree that this is a really terrific program today. And I want to thank you and the Atlantic Council and the Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security. It has really been an honor for us to partner with the Atlantic Council and bring some excellent speakers together on this important topic. You know, we at Thomson Reuters are fortunate to have the Atlantic Council in partnership with us, and we're doing a range of work from substantive work in the financial sector with a series of reports called The Danger of Divergence, as well as prior work on combating financial crime. But today we're going to talk about big data. And big data gets a lot of discussion, whether it's scrutiny over what data is being collected or ways in which it can help business and the economy grow. But today's discussion is a little bit different because big data and technology is being used by bad actors, whether individual criminals, organized crime, cyber attackers, violent extremists, or human traffickers. It's hard to believe this, but it's true. You know, we at Thomson Reuters are on the ground floor in this battle. Our risk management business serves over 10,000 companies, spanning over 180 countries. Our investigative services within our legal business partner with law enforcement and private sector companies to bring bad actors to justice and to protect the public. Companies in the public policy sector rely on us to provide the intelligence and tools they need to make informed decisions based on risk and opportunity, from identifying money laundering at financial institutions to using public records to track down fraud, corruption, and other criminal activity. We at Thomson Reuters are there with trusted answers from trusted sources. I also want to mention the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and we've been deeply involved at the foundation bringing together law enforcement and financial firms in Europe and the US to combat human trafficking, and you'll note there's a panel at the end of the day on this. Human trafficking and modern-day slavery using big data methods. The foundation and its partners in the public and private sector are marshaling considerable forces against those who seek to profit from slavery, something that has no place in modern society. I look forward to a series of engaging discussions today, and so I'm going to turn it over to Carl Schonander from SIIA, the Software and Information Industry Association, to lead our first discussion today. Cross-border data flows, bringing bad actors to justice. Carl is the director of the International Public Policy at the SIIA, and he has a deep understanding of international policy with 25 years of experience at the State Department, most recently as senior advisor for Europe, OECD, and intellectual property affairs. Please welcome Carl and the first panel of the day. Carl?
Good morning, everybody. I guess the first order of business is to make sure that everybody can hear me. Everybody can hear me? Excellent. So my name is Carl Schonander. I'm with the Software and Information Industry Association, as you heard. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council and Thomson Reuters for putting on this extremely important event on cross-border data flows and key to bringing bad actors to justice. I and we at the association and others have worked a lot on the economic dimensions of the question of cross-border data flows, but I think this particular element of the discussion on the importance of how data flows are key to dealing with the problems of counterterrorism, drug trafficking, human trafficking are not as appreciated, and so I think, or not as well known. So I think this debate is really, really timely and interesting. So let me just introduce our panelists before we start the discussion. So Clay Lowery, at the end here, is a vice president at Rock Creek Global Advisors, which is an international economic policy advisory firm, and he focuses on international financial regulation, sovereign debt, exchange rates, and investment policy. He's also a senior advisor at CSIS. Previously, Clay served as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs at the U.S. Treasury Department. Right here is Juan Zarate.
Well said.
Thank you.
Very nicely done, Carl.
Thank you. He is the chairman and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network. He's the senior national security analyst for CBS News. He's a visiting lecturer at Harvard Law School and CSIS senior fellow. Now, previously, Juan was the assistant secretary of Treasury for terrorism financing. So Clay and Juan worked together in the 2000s a lot.
I watched Clay work his magic.
Juan was the bad guy. I was
All right. We've got good cop, bad cop here. So, and I don't want to forget, Juan is also the chairman of something called the Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance as well. So we also have in the middle Siobhan Gordon, who is a director in Brunswick's Washington, D.C. office, where she focuses on the corporate data and privacy practice. Now, previously, she had an extremely successful career in journalism. She was actually nominated 3 times for a Pulitzer Prize. And she has worked at the Wall Street Journal, the Baltimore Sun, the National Journal, and the Washington Post. So thanks to all of you for joining us today. So I'd actually like to start with you, Juan. We all know the financial system is huge. We know that there's a formal system, there's an informal system. I remember when people talked about terrorism finance, people talked about the Hawala system a lot, for example. That used to be a big topic of conversation. A couple of days ago, during the Democratic debate, Secretary Clinton talked about shadow banking. So I would like, if possible, if you could give us all a sense of the dimensions of the problem. How big or small a problem is it? Is it growing? Is it about the same? Tell us what you think.
Well, that's a big question. First of all, thank you, Carl. It's an honor to be here. I want to thank Atlantic Council and Thomson Reuters as well. Welcome all of you. Thanks to the midshipmen who are here. It's wonderful to see you, and thanks for your commitment to the country. Appreciate it. The problem is interesting in several dimensions. The reality is that the financial system is recognized now, in particular by illicit actors, as a core dimension of the global system. And so any organization, individual, network, rogue state that wants access to capital, that wants reach, that wants to be able to give animation to its agenda or ideology, needs access to the financial system. The financial system means lots of different things, and Clay on the panel is probably one of the greatest experts to talk to you about sort of the complexity of the financial system. But the financial system's everything from how people make and raise money at the ground level, all the way to the sophisticated sinews of the financial system globally, where money is moved to the tune of trillions of dollars a day in sophisticated markets. And the reality is that illicit actors have found their ways into all dimensions of the financial system for profit, for relationships, and for reach, and also as a tool of their agenda. And I think that's a reality of the 21st century, whether you're talking about terrorist groups or organized crime groups or cyber activists or hacktivists or rogue regimes. The reality is all of them are playing in the market, so to speak, and are trying to access financial systems to their benefit. Now, one of the interesting dimensions that we've seen over the last couple of years is the fact that both non-state and state actors have grown more sophisticated in how they've thought about the financial system, both as a commodity tool, but also a weapon. And a recognition by America's enemies in particular that the financial system is not just a great tool for them, but also a great point of vulnerability for the United States, that the great dependencies that the U.S. has on its financial system, on the cyber infrastructure, on complex commercial system supply chains, is really a fundamental vulnerability for the United States and Western systems. And so it's no secret then that you've had actors of all stripes beginning to, for example, attack and probe Western banks with DDoS attacks coming from Iran and Syria, probing attacks coming from organized crime groups, sophisticated fraudulent groups trying to raise money from their fraudulent activities. And so what's interesting to me is that the banking community and the financial community really is now kind of at the center of the cyberstorm in terms of what these groups are trying to do, because the banks and the financial system is where the money is. And so that's a form of profit. It's a tool of access and reach globally. If you can get into the financial system, you can get access to data, you can get access to systems worldwide. And finally, if you can disrupt it, you can have a great systemic and asymmetric effect to what you're doing. And so that's why I think this space is so interesting and it's so important we're having this discussion, because there is a dimension of strategic threat to the fact that these groups have figured out that the financial system is not just critical to their bottom line, but also critical as a vulnerability to the West.
Okay. I will get to the rest of the panel, but I want to ask you a follow-up question on that, because I thought it was very interesting what you said. You talked about U.S. vulnerabilities here. typically when people think about the U.S. financial system, they often think about how the U.S. financial system is actually very strong and that it can be used as an element of U.S. power. And in fact, you did that in the 2000s. So could you talk about the other side of the coin a little bit, about how we can use the system to address these very problems that we're talking about?
Well, it's a great point, and I think it's one of the innovations of the last 15 years, which was how do we think about the use of American dominance in the global system, the role of the dollar, the attractiveness of our capital markets, the robustness and redundancy and resilience of our economy to the benefit of U.S. interests or international security. What the strategies in essence did and continue to do is to be able to use that power then to isolate rogue financial activity, to be able to say, to define what is legitimate, to define what is acceptable, and then to use U.S. tools, suasion, and market activity to actually then isolate actors from the system. This is a kind of an evolutionary leap from classic trade sanctions, which has sort of been the tool of classic statecraft over the years. This is more a sense of how do we use the global system itself, how do we use the predominant place of the U.S. in that system, and the international buy-in from all of the collective actors, to include China and Russia, to the benefit of not just the U.S. but the international system. There are dangers to doing that, to the overuse, overreach. There are lessons that we've taught countries like China and Russia, which are now flirting with the use of economic tools and persuasion and even sanctions for their own benefit. And I think we're now in a period where nation states, in particular the major economies, are thinking more aggressively about how they use their own economic power and influence in this domain. But without a doubt, this remains a key tool for how we think about dealing with illicit actors that at the end of the day need money, they need access to the capital markets, they need access to the financial system. If they're to be more than just a corner threat in some part of the world, if they're to have reach, they need access to the financial world. And the U.S. in many ways still remains predominant and can define the rules of the road as a result.
Thank you, Juan. So, Shaban, I'd like to ask you a question. So there's sort of a contradiction. You have these recognized counterterrorism threats, drug threats, etc. Yet you also have governments around the world, I think rightfully, trying to make sure that consumer privacy is protected. So governments want access, they also want to protect. Do you see that as a contradiction? Do you see that as a tension? Could you comment on that?
Sure. I think it's definitely a tension, and we've seen more of that lately. I mean, we saw it just recently with the EU court's rejection of this safe harbor agreement between the U.S. and Europe, which would have allowed, more data sharing, so to speak, between the two countries, and that's now up in the air. And the two, the U.S. and the EU are going to have, I think, until January to try to sort out whether or not they can reach some sort of accommodation. And it's interesting. There's been a huge evolution. When Juan and his team in government were sort of attacking this problem, I think that there was a broader sense, both in the U.S. and globally at that time, that counterterrorism measures were taking predominance. You sort of kind of constantly have this shifting balance between security and privacy. And while I agree with the notion of you can have both, I'm not sure that you are always striking a perfect balance between both. And how various governments, whether it's the U.S. or overseas, decide that they want to strike that balance at any given point in time is dependent on a whole host of factors. And obviously, I think the main shift that we've seen in the last couple of years, was at least we saw the response to the Snowden leaks as, at the very least, being symptomatic of where sort of the public mood was at that point. And there probably was some causation there as well, especially in Europe, in terms of European public and key elements of governments in Europe, especially in Germany, becoming very, very upset about the level of this data exchange that was being done in the name of counterterrorism. And so I think that we've seen a shift, but I also think that if the Snowden leaks had happened 5 years prior, I'm not sure that we would have seen the same reaction. And so it's kind of been a confluence of events where time passes since 9/11. People start to see lots of other issues in the world that need to be addressed beyond terrorism. And so the benefit of counterterrorism operations is now being weighed against a whole other set of potential costs. And one of those is privacy. There are also economic costs, and that's certainly something that governments are also weighing. So I think that there is an inherent tension there, and that's probably appropriate because you want to make sure that governments are not being so aggressive with counterterrorism operations that they're violating key privacy principles. But I think that the back and forth that you're seeing now is sort of the latest example of those kinds of issues and tension.
So that's very interesting, Siobhan. I think in life, in politics, timing is everything. There's been a lot of commentary about the new French surveillance law, for instance, which came on the heels of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. I wonder, given what you just said, whether you would care to comment on that law and why you think it came about the way it came about.
Well, I'm not an expert in sort of the sort of French political dynamics, but I do. My reaction when I saw that law was that, that was pretty striking, especially from a U.S. perspective. I mean, the level of sort of surveillance and invasiveness that it would grant the government is quite striking. And it was interesting to me to actually speak with colleagues of mine in our Paris office, for example, who said, well, this is sort of where the mood is now, but I think that now we're starting to see in the French public a little bit more pushback on that. And it's not that dissimilar from the kind of back and forth that we've also seen in the U.S. over these types of issues. And so, the European sort of definitions of key privacy principles tend to be a little bit different from the U.S., and they vary obviously among countries in Europe. The UK sees it differently from France, from Germany. But it is interesting to see how these dynamics are now playing out sort of in different countries within Europe, because they're facing major terrorist threats just like we do in the U.S. and just like many countries in the Middle East are also facing, and every country kind of has to work that out. But it is a major tension, I think, that we're seeing between sort of governments and the public and people who have key privacy principles that they want to make sure are upheld.
Thank you. So Clay, I'd like to ask you, given your perspective now in the private sector with Rock Creek Advisors and your previous role as Assistant Secretary for International Affairs, what you think about these issues, and if you have views on kind of what policy tools exist to bring bad actors to justice, and the role that data flows, internet cross-border data flows, plays in doing precisely that.
Thank you, Carl. Also, I want to thank Thomson Reuters and the Atlantic Council for putting this event together. And I think Siobhan made a very good point, which is it's very, very timely. So let me, I'm going to give you a long-winded answer because it's my chance to talk, right? I think that a few things need to be. One is this event is called Big Data Bad Actors. All right, so let's think about that for a second. We have had a variety of events that have led to why we think of bad actors, but is the definition of bad actors expanded? So there are a few things that we used to think about as vulnerabilities from big data. Privacy, as Siobhan just went through. National security type of issues. I used to chair a group called CFIUS, which looked at foreign investment in the United States. The biggest problem we all heard about, remember there was a port that got bought and that created all sorts of problems. That wasn't real problems. The real issues were trying to figure out who controls the pipes, who controls the switches, and things like that within the system, the cyber system, and is that a national security threat to the United States? Third is the cybersecurity hacking that we've all seen, and we can't pick up a newspaper, it seems like, without seeing a company get hacked, the government get hacked. And does that create problems? And then fourth is just, I don't know what to call it, but like the Snowden effect. Okay, so in some respects, what was at one time the fear of data spreading was something that the national security, homeland security kind of clique used to worry about. Then it became something that we had to worry about from our newspapers. Then it became something we had to worry about maybe from our own government, our own companies, and maybe even data itself. But I say all that because I wanted to say, because it's big data, bad actors, but let's talk about what's positive about big data. So big data, from a cross-border perspective, we think of wonderful, amazing firms like Amazon.com or Apple or Google or Facebook or what have you, and they've been able to figure out how to use data and do some amazing things with it. And sometimes people don't like what they've done with it. But it also has allowed for improvements in automobile manufacturing. Improvements not just in like designs, but basically the ability through data so that if there is a crash, local authorities will know how to deal with that crash much better. That has become from learning on using data. It is about agricultural community using data and knowledge that they have gained from around the world in order to get better crop yields. And I think Juan went over this pretty well, which is in the financial services sector, which uses data in a huge way across the world. It has also actually helped us find bad actors that are anti-money laundering, use our anti-money laundering tools, both from the financial institutions perspective as well as from the government perspective, because those people are using cross-border flows. So the policy response on how do you think about these kind of, Siobhan used the word balance. I actually don't, I like that word, no offense to her. I like, the tension I think is a good word though. And the design of policy response is a very difficult one. And one response that we've seen that I want to, kind of a hobby horse of mine, is the ability we're going to localize our data. We're going to put our data servers in my country. So if you're the United States, you have to put it in the United States. If you're Europe, you have to put it in Europe. This is silly policy. And this is not real policy thinking. So, but it is a normal reaction from, I want to protect my citizens. I want to protect their privacy. I want to protect from the national security. I want to protect from cyber hacking. I want to protect them maybe from internal Edward Snowden things. But I think that you have to figure out, is that a real good response? And does that get towards your trade-offs of commercial, entrepreneurial enterprise around the world versus security type of issues? Those trade-offs have to be thought through from a policy perspective. Why don't I stop there? I have my own thoughts on some of these things, but I also feel like I just went on too long. So.
I don't think you did. And I promise to open it up for questions in about 2 minutes. Again, in terms of policy responses, and I'd like to open this up to all the panelists here. What do you recommend? Do you recommend provisions in trade agreements? Should the world's treasury departments be working together more? Should there be an international treaty on this? All the above, none of the above? And I'll start with you, Juan.
It's a good question, and maybe it's worth taking just a quick step back, because I think how you frame the problem and the issue then helps define what policy recommendations you have. But I think this question of big data, bad actors, good use, to Clay's point, really depends on the venue and the form you're talking about, because the sensitivities around big data come around issues of trust, use, who's retaining the data. And so I think looking at it through 3 different lenses is really important, and then that helps define what we want to do. One is, what are individual expectations with respect to how we think about sharing data and big data? And those expectations are sort of shifting every day, right? The reasonable expectation of privacy, putting my lawyer hat on, that's shifting, right? And the courts are actually kind of recognizing that. You know, we put a lot out there, right, voluntarily, and we do it within our family circles, within our friends, within communities of interest. And in some ways, that's acceptable and, in fact, desirable. And so there's a whole set of expectations that are built around data in that context and in those communities. Then you have sort of the corporate and commercial use of data, which in some ways is a little bit of a mixed bag. To Clay's point, people like the ability to have customized sensibilities as to how data is used, innovations. You know, in electoral politics, some real interesting innovations about micro-targeting, et cetera. All really interesting, but some questions as to how far we're willing to let the commercial world go with the use of data, whether it's banks, whether it's Apple, whether it's Facebook, et cetera. So that's a bit more ambivalent, but still more in the constructive context. And then the question of, okay, what are governments doing with data? And that's where you get into a much more tenuous sort of domain, the tension that we were talking about. And that's where you get sort of the movement toward the right to anonymity, the right to be forgotten, because I think the sense of data retention, potential use for authoritarian purposes or otherwise by governments is a strong tendency. And I think that's what's driven a lot of the drive toward digital currencies, for example, the ability to anonymize and be in control of one's own financial dealings in a way that doesn't touch governments. And so that is a much more suspicious, tenuous domain that frankly is driven by episodes of news coverage as well as crises. And so Snowden sort of drives the pendulum one way. The Abdul Muttalib underwear bomber drives it the other way. You know, the moment there's a moment of crisis, that debate in the government context shifts very quickly and dynamically. So what does that all mean? I think it means it's an incredibly fluid environment. Data is not going away. We're being very demanding of ourselves, of our companies, of our governments to use data creatively, effectively, even predictively. You look at hotspot analysis, for example, by local police, by national governments to look to see where threats or crime patterns are emerging. That's seen as a very helpful and good use of data and an efficient use of resources. So that has to continue. It will continue. The technology will drive it. Secondly, I think the use of technology itself to innovate and to help with this balance. I often describe, and I'm on the board of advisors to Coinbase, which is this Bitcoin exchange platform. The reality is some of these technologies could actually serve both interests, where it can allow, for example, the blockchain technology can allow for traceability, but does allow for certain degrees of anonymity. And so there are new technologies that I think are coming online that actually enhance the ability to ultimately track and trace and create transparency, but also provide first-line anonymity and protection of privacy. So actually trying to find where that middle ground is through the use of technology is critical. And third, information sharing is critical. And I think one of the challenges in the transatlantic domain is this tension of what does data sharing look like? We ran across this in the terrorist financing tracking program, where we'd established a program at Treasury along with SWIFT to capture the data related to terrorist financing tied to cross-border wires and money flows. Created a huge stir in Europe when it was made public by the New York Times in 2006. The program continues. It's incredibly helpful and useful to the intelligence community on both sides of the Atlantic, but there continue to be sort of these vacillations of interest around that kind of sharing. So I think ensconcing the notion that we have to have data sharing in order to be effective at what we're doing at an international security level is critical.
Yeah, I think what you said about the terrorist finance tracking program is very interesting. I mean, some of you may know that the United States and the European Union just very recently concluded the Umbrella Agreement on law enforcement cooperation, which the Europeans actually conditioned on passage of something called the Judicial Redress Act. So that's actually the House of Representatives actually passed judicial redress a couple of days ago. We're hoping the Senate does the same. Anyway, just one element in trying to sort out this transatlantic digital issue. Siobhan.
Well, I think Juan made a good point in that there are a lot of, you've got to figure out kind of which problem you're trying to solve. And there are so many that are, I mean, whether it is sort of money laundering or terrorism financing or hacking or what have you. I mean, there's such a range of issues. And I think that, you know, each component kind of would need a particular set of policies or agreements or what have you. One element of it that we haven't talked about as much, but I think actually represents one of the larger policy challenges, and I will not profess to have the answers, is actually dealing with you know, bad actors in cyberspace and sort of the hacking realm internationally. I mean, we saw the latest agreement, so to speak. Actually, I think there was also one yesterday with the UK between, you know, China having starting to forge agreements with Western countries about, you know, not permitting intellectual property theft. But I think it took maybe a week or two after the U.S. agreement to start seeing reports out from computer security companies that this kind of activity was still going on with alleged Chinese hackers. And so I think that one area where we probably have the least experience, counterterrorism, we now have, you know, almost 2 decades of experience, if not more, in terms of trying to figure out how to sort through you know, cooperative agreements around data, and it's not perfect, and it obviously runs into snags, but I feel like there's at least sort of a structure there and almost a set of, at least a better understanding of where both sides are coming from. So you will, I feel like there's a reasonable expectation that folks will come to some sort of agreement, especially between the US and Europe on this. I think that the hacking realm is a huge unknown. I mean, we can't even figure it out in the US. What had for many years been considered a pretty minimalist policy approach within the US sort of government of data sharing, voluntary data sharing between companies and the government has now become a huge political problem in the Senate. And it's just interesting to watch that, given that, you know, 5 years ago, there were far more aggressive policies that were promoted by both parties, and it's just become so politicized within the U.S. that it's very difficult for our government to figure out what to do, much less how to deal with it with other countries overseas. With Europe, you do run into the privacy issues. With you know, governments like China, you just run into issues where both countries just define the problems completely differently. And so I think that you know, that's probably the area where we need considerable focus at this point, just because it's so nascent, and the path forward is really unclear. But we'll see if Congress tackles it first.
Go ahead.
So I think Juan and Siobhan have put it well, which is, look, my view is, again, from a policy perspective, is you ad hoc solutions to these tricky issues are not going to work. And by the way, secondly, especially when you're thinking about cross-border flows, which is what we're talking about in some respects, unilateral defenses or unilateral protectionist measures, maybe that's too strong, are also not probably the appropriate approach. I think Juan puts kind of coming up with a framework is important. Siobhan, I think, raises a great point, which I'm not sure I'd thought about well enough. My own view, so I see this as there are things that you can do in trade agreements that will help with not going towards unilateral approaches. Now, those are mainly from a positive commercial perspective of you shall not, so to speak, restrict data from flowing across borders to different parts of the world. You shall not make it so that if you're a company, you must have your server in a country and it must stay in that country at all times. So I think that that's a positive thing, but that's probably more from a commercial perspective, though I think it does go towards law enforcement and follow the money enforcement and things like that as well. Because again, I think the localization of data is just a bad idea in general. But I think that if we have to try to figure out how do you deal with privacy, how do you deal with security, and how do you deal with good commercial enterprises, coming up with multilateral agreements or bilateral agreements is definitely the approach. So Siobhan talked about the China case. All right, so look, I'm not Fred mentioned we have people here who are CEOs and technologists and really smart people, and I'm not any of those. But I will say that on the US-China, do I think that that is going to solve our cyber problems between the United States and China? No, I do not. But I will say that it was a very positive step because it at least got us away from the ad hoc either screaming at each other or coming up with some defense mechanism, or frankly, sanctioning on something which, good Lord, I have no idea how you're going to prove. And instead moving towards maybe a step towards a longer term goal of coming up with an arrangement that could work, given that technology changes and that our systems change. So I think that that's the type of policy approaches we need to be looking at.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to the floor now for questions. So if you want to ask a question, if you could just raise your hand and then identify yourself and ask the question. Gentleman over there.
Yes, hi. My name is Alan Ditterman. I'm an Army officer with My name is Alan Ditterman. I'm an Army officer with the National Defense University. I'd like to ask a question to the panel regarding localization of data. And while I understand in a broader sense, multilateral agreements are always better than localized agreements, I don't foresee multilateral governance regarding privacy and protection of data anytime soon. And we've historically seen other nations apply economic coercion to get access to data or source code and stuff like that. So how do we strike a balance between not working towards localized data and not having a multilateral governance to regulate that sort of thing? Thank you.
Why don't you start?
Well, it's been my hobby horse, so maybe I should. Yeah, I know. I apologize. So I'm not sure I totally agree with the premise of the question or your analysis that was part of your question. One is there are ways to actually try to address these things a little bit bilateral and multilateral. Is there going to be a big giant WTO agreement that ropes in 180 countries? No, probably no. But let's look at the TPP agreement. All right. Now, none of us have seen the TPP agreement unless you have some sort of immediate access that I certainly don't have. But what there is in that agreement, I believe, is that the United States pushed very hard and got that we will allow for, one, on every area in that trade agreement, with the exception of financial services, that data shall not be restricted from flowing across borders. That you cannot create rules that says you must put your server or your cloud or whatever in that country. In other words, it can be in different places. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have exceptions for national security purposes, or that you can't have or you can't create licensing agreements and so forth. The one exception I said was financial services, and frankly, that is the United States that created that problem. The United States decided that financial services is different than other industries, and did not basically say that we should not be allowed to store data locally. I actually think, frankly, the US was wrong on this issue. And I'm sure that the Fed and the SEC and the Treasury Department would disagree with me, but too bad, I disagree with them. All right, so, and I would say that, by the way, the Chinese might actually learn some lessons from how the United States just treated the TPP. But it does suggest to me that there are ways to get there where we have 12 countries, 40% of world GDP, including countries like Vietnam, who are actually basically agreeing to doing what you just asked about. Secondly, on privacy. The United States and the EU have different definitions on privacy, different tensions on privacy, different like how important is this and so forth. We did create a safe harbor agreement 15 years ago. It's fallen apart in the last month, excuse me, as Siobhan mentioned. We have a lot of work to repair that and put it back together again. I'm not blaming anybody. The court made a decision in the EU, so that means that we're going to have to deal with it. But it does suggest it is possible to come up with those agreements. Then you have to figure out, okay, but you do have different legal regimes and you have different ways of viewing it. And if we don't, I promise you, it is going to very much hinder commerce between the United States and Europe. You're already seeing companies are like, how are we going to deal with this? I mean, and I think that coming up with a broader framework is going to be very important to us. So I think that it is possible. That doesn't mean it's not difficult.
Juan?
I just want to piggyback off of that because I think, as Clay said, you can create carve-outs and specific agreements that do allow parameters for information sharing. And in the financial services context, I completely agree with Clay. I think it's a missed opportunity to allow for greater information sharing and fluidity in the markets. I'll give you an example of where this is affecting on the illicit side, where major global banks that have operations around the world are being asked by the U.S. Treasury and regulators to manage their risk, to understand if they're doing business with bad actors, to screen against the OFAC list, et cetera. But guess what? They can't consolidate their data. Why? Because they have to deal with jurisdictional rules that in different parts of the world don't allow that data to flow neatly to New York or London or to Frankfurt, or wherever the hub is. That data can't easily flow. And so these major global banks, which are trying to do the right thing, frankly, from my perspective, are being, have one arm tied behind their back because of this international structure that doesn't allow for information sharing within their own structure. It's their data and their customers' data, and yet they can't share it in a way that's active, that allows predictive technology, all the things that we like about big data in terms of understanding risk. They can't do it. And it's, in some ways, a structure of how we've built the international system around data sharing, data collection, data retention that really is hindering the ability for global organizations to manage risk. And that hinders their ability, that hinders law enforcement, and creates real blind spots. And I think the lesson there is we've got to have real specific carve-outs if we're not going to create a superstructure to this. We've got to create legal and policy carve-outs that allow for this kind of information sharing. That's happening slowly but surely because people are realizing this problem, but that's an example of where you've got a real impediment.
Do you have a comment or no?
Just briefly, I mean, I think that both Clay and Juan make really good points, and I think more broadly what they're pointing to is just the notion of you need to look broadly at kind of the incentives that are involved, and if you can shift the incentives, for a country to localize its data away from that and toward a more international approach based on either collective action by at least a critical mass of countries, or what the dynamics are within the financial system. If there are ways to play with that, then I think that you can maybe start to shift it away from the localization thing, which again, just kind of, I mean, that had been percolating along, but seemed to really sort of gain momentum kind of post-Snowden. So if that notion kind of can shift the incentive system in one way, I think that there probably are ways to, through, creating business, shifting business interests or adjusting incentives to make governments and business interests align a little bit more in the direction of kind of a more international approach, that there are probably ways to do it.
I think there was a question over there.
Hi, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I find this topic fascinating because you're talking about global and terrorism and hacking, and I just have been very active in the judicial reform. And we've learned that states have data, and they show that some states, for the for-profit prisons that have a 90% occupancy guarantee to the people that own the prisons, some of those states, the people that are not white tend to have a sentence that is 3 to 4 times greater than somebody that's white. We were trying to figure it out because was it because they had better lawyers? Is it really discrimination? And now all of a sudden, the DAs in certain counties are realizing that, wait a second, they can use the data to kind of pinpoint which DA is actually going for harsher sentences for people of different color. And so states now don't want to give the data to the federal government. So when you're talking about America and us sharing data with other countries, we're going to have that own situation in America. And so it's kind of an interesting topic for me. So if you have any advice that could be a global standard, not just within different countries, but just even as far as America, that'd be great.
That's a fascinating question. Any of you care to take that one on?
Well, first of all, it's a great example of how data can be used in all sorts of very interesting ways to understand social dynamics, the justice system, et cetera. So commend you for your work and trying to figure out what's going on there. I don't know enough about your project, so I can't speak directly to it or to that data. But an analogous issue that touches on the federalism issues and problems that you're describing surrounds this notion of beneficial ownership around corporate formation. This is a big deal in the financial community as well as in the corporate world, and certainly in the world that worries about money laundering and illicit finance, because one of the core principles in the field is you have to understand who the beneficiary is for any institution or set of assets that you're engaged in. So if you're a bank, a major global bank, you have to know your customer, and that means you have to know the beneficial interests of whether it's a wire transfer, a bank deposit, a credit line, whatever it is. You need to understand who's really behind the transaction, who's behind the shell corporation. The U.S. actually does not have a rule that sets out the standards for what that actually means and requires. The Treasury Department has put out a proposed rule after about 10 years of internal wrangling, and my business partner, Chip Ponce, was the one driving this within the Treasury Department, and is still not out. The reason I raise it is it's a reflection of the fact that you have state rules that dictate corporate formation, Delaware rules, Montana rules, et cetera, and there's no sort of uniformity as to what we require of institutions or even the states in terms of what information they require for the creation of corporations and the understanding of beneficial ownership. So shell companies can buy real property in Manhattan, and you're not quite sure what Russian or Chinese interests lie behind them. The New York Times did a very interesting series on this a few months ago. And so it's an analogous issue where you've got lots of data out there in pockets. It's not uniformly sort of gathered. And there aren't clear rules as to how it can be shared and used. And that's front and center. And in fact, the U.S. is probably going to be criticized internationally on this next year when the Financial Action Task Force assesses the U.S. system. And they're going to say this is a gaping hole in the U.S. anti-money laundering system, and it needs to be fixed.
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Thanks. I'm Robert Sharetta, President of International Investor. I'd like to go back to blind spots and the title of this session, which is Bringing Bad Actors to Justice. I came in late, but I haven't heard much about actually bringing them to justice. We follow the money, and it's no longer just Liechtenstein and Guernsey and the Bahamas. We now see 100 money centers in the Pacific, in the eastern China and elsewhere. These blind spots, they're not reporting data. The bad guys don't care about trade agreements. They don't care about governance. You're all smart people. You all try to follow these issues. Do you get the sense sometimes that there's a lot more happening beyond the scope of data collection that we should be concerned about?
Maybe take a quick crack
Sure, go ahead.
at this. I started my career as a federal prosecutor, so in the terrorism section. So appreciate your question. What's the end state here in terms of bringing folks to justice? I think the international community in the U.S., in addition, has real problems bringing legal cases, and even to Clay's point about the use of targeted sanctions, to be able to make cases against very sophisticated financial networks. And you see a lot of discussion in the U.S. around going after financial facilitators, those that are third-party money launderers. those that sit in banking centers or serve as the key fulcrum around money laundering schemes or for rogue regimes. They're out there, and Shaban has done some great reporting about this over the course of many years. They're out there. The problem is making cases against these individuals and networks in a credible way and in a way that's effective. In some ways, you've seen bits and pieces of this. The FIFA case is an interesting example of the U.S. bringing legal charges in a way that has strategic impact on the sporting industry and internationally. And so those are good examples of where you can have a particular case that then begins to spark a broader strategic discussion. The case against the 6 Chinese PLA officers for cyber hacking, another great example, right? Nobody expects the Chinese to extradite these individuals, of course not. The point is that the use of the indictment or the use of sanctions, ultimately in the case of cyber espionage and malicious use of cyber hacking, actually drives the strategic dialogue. And so sometimes the use of the justice system, targeted sanctions, is not just about individual accountability, but it's also about strategic maneuvers and messaging.
Thanks, Juan. We actually have 3 more minutes. So I'm going to ask the panelists, each of the panelists, to speak for, I don't know, 45 seconds each, and then I'll do a 1-minute conclusion. I'll start with you, Clay.
Well, actually, I will go to your point. Look, I unlike Juan, and I'm not an enforcement person. I haven't prosecuted anybody in my life, unless you talk to my kids. That they say persecuted, but that but the point I think I was trying to make was that the policy tools to try to deal with the trade-offs are tools that if you don't use the right ones, or if you do the things I focus on localization of data servers, but if you're going to actually hurt law enforcement, you're going to actually harm getting those bad actors, and that's because government officials or enforcement officials, and by the way, sometimes private sector officials, kind of to Juan's point earlier about how banks are trying to make sure that they don't have money go to bad guys. Well, sometimes it's hard to get the data. How do I find the different sources that are out there? Unless we make sure that we have agreements on how allowing data to flow in a better way, my view is that you are actually not just harming business, you're not harming Facebook, you're harming enforcement, you're harming how do we respond to humanitarian crisis, you're harming people that are trying to fight against slavery that we were talking about earlier. So I think that was sort of, that's the way I was trying to think through the problem.
Siobhan.
Actually, I'll just piggyback on what Juan was saying in answer to the prior question. Just 2 points in terms of the way that you can use enforcement mechanisms beyond just sort of what their most obvious purpose would be. The case of the indictments against the PLA hackers was particularly interesting because my understanding was that the Justice Department and the Obama administration spent a good 3 years trying to figure out exactly how to pursue that, whether to pursue it, under what conditions, which cases to take, could you find U.S. companies that would be willing to be named, all with the notion of basically just sending a message. Not that they thought that they were going to be able to pick these guys up, but they could restrict their travel, they could make life a little more difficult, and it would broadly send a message, and then they could see how's China going to respond. So as you sort of try to work your way through a new area, sometimes it's just sort of figuring out, well, we can do this, it's going to send a signal, and then we can kind of see what the fallout is and course correct as needed. And
they responded with laughter.
Right. And so what was interesting was that then we saw in this latest go around over the summer, we saw Susan Rice going over to Beijing and saying, hey guys, we want to come up with some sort of agreement. And by the way, we have this new tool in our back pocket, sanctions. And so we can either try to work on coming to an agreement, or we can kind of continue along on the retaliation side. And it's an interesting calculation to do it that way, because it also means that if you then come to an agreement, are you a little bit more hindered in actually using sanctions, or does that make it more complicated? But it was interesting to see the U.S. government starting to figure out how to use some of these tools in the hacking arena, and it's not going to be totally successful, but to at least start to see what's the cause and effect here when you start to employ them.
2000, and I just love to dovetail off of Shaban on this, because I think what's interesting in the cyber domain is the fact that you have these financial tools that have been applied on terrorist financing, proliferation financing, organized crime, drug money laundering, now being thought of in the context of cyber hacking and use of cyber espionage, with huge potential consequences, right? You go after some major Chinese state-owned enterprises, you know, we'll see what the response is, right? And I think that has been a bit of a tempering dimension of what you've seen from the administration. But it's also the reality, and it goes back to my initial point, that the banks and the financial community are at the center of the cyberstorm, and they're at the center of the policy world, and in part because sanctions have been seen in this sort of era as incredibly effective, as perhaps one of the only tools that we have to affect this issue, and frankly as a way of developing some cyber deterrence, which everyone has been grappling with for some time, and no doubt you're studying in your classes. So I think that's fascinating. One other final point, and this is a big point, maybe it leads into the other panels, but something I've written about recently, which is we need, in the cyber domain, a much more active sense of public-private. And this goes beyond just information sharing. Mm-hmm. This goes to a 21st century notion of cyber privateering, right? We had this notion at the founding of the Republic. It's in our Constitution when it came to maritime defense and domain, when much of that was in the hands of the private sector, and the government and the private sector had to interact to secure the sea lanes and our merchandise and our merchant vessels. You know, 80% of the cyber infrastructure and data system sits in private sector hands. Much of that is critical to our economy, our society. We haven't thought aggressively enough about what that coordination and what that looks like. And I'm not talking about hacking back, but I'm talking about a more proactive, active defense that that allows the interaction between private sector and public sector. I've got lots of ideas on that, but I think it's important to keep that in mind, that when we talk about data, we talk about bad actors, it's critical that the private sector not be seen as sort of simply a complement,
Sure.
but it has to be seen as a protagonist.
Juan, I'm really glad you mentioned the public-private. It's going to have to be a subject for another panel, as you mentioned, but very important. 10 seconds in terms of takeaways from this, from everything our panelists have said. Data is not going away. Big data is here to stay. It's only exploding. It's going to become more and more important. There's lots of studies out on that demonstrate that. Data flows, very important, both economically, but also for catching bad actors. There are lots of ways of dealing with the issues, but international cooperation is better than unilateralism. There are all sorts of tools out there. There are trade agreements you can work with. There are law enforcement agreements. We mentioned the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program, the Umbrella Agreement, the multilateral, the MLAT agreements, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty agreements. They clearly need to be updated and made more efficient in this context as well. With that, I'd like to thank again the Atlantic Council and Thomson Reuters and lead the way to the next panel.
Thank you.